Right, shutter and lens assembly. What do we got here? Well, there's the retainer ring. The rear group doesn't want to come off. I'll have to put a friction tool on that. There's the front group. A couple of marks on the front, a couple of marks on the back. They'll probably clean off. They're probably just dirt or something. I'll find out. A friction tool. That's what we need. It's unscrewed. I'm just checking this to make sure that's not loose. That's good. Let's look at the shutter. It's certainly been serviced before. Someone's gone to a great deal of trouble to scribe a line across there to tell them how tight where they needed to position that retaining ring. I don't do that personally. I rely on my experience and being able to judge how tight the retaining ring needs to be. This is a little bit scarred. People have obviously pushed this around with a screwdriver tip. This is quite dirty here. Bit greasy looking. Get these front control rings off. I'm looking at this piece here. This ring couples to the aperture settings and it's nickel plated steel. It's very prone to corrosion. If there's going to be a problem with corrosion, you'll see it there. There's no problem with that. Here's our shutter speeds setting cam plate. This is internal ring. You could call it the internal cocking ring. Bit dirty looking, otherwise nothing in particular. The shutter release lever. This has been somewhat chewed up here. Someone's been poking in there. You can see the shape of that. That's just supposed to be a simple right angle there. You can see that's sort of got a bit of a complex curve to it. I'll have to do my best to straighten that out or replace it completely. We know this particular camera had a problem with the shutter release. That was probably in multiple areas on the camera, probably at the shutter button, certainly down the side in here it was bad. The arm that couples across, that was bent. Not only was it bent, the top of it was loose on the shaft so that it wasn't moving correctly. Multiple issues. The main spring here, let's unhook that and I'll have a look at it. This is a very good one with a spring lying on its back. I've got the tail here facing towards me. If that, you take that as 12 o'clock position, the little upright piece here is coming up at about the 2 o'clock position. That is how springs are supposed to look. They very rarely look like that. Years ago, when shutters were being serviced, that spring would have been replaced as a matter of course. They lose their oomph over time and that causes you problems. That was a particularly good example. I don't see many good examples these days. Mostly I'm seeing tired, worn out ones. Alright, we'll just remove the flash think stuff here. Everything in the side of the shutter is dirty looking. Probably the ingress of dust and dirt, but it may also be a reflection of how much grease has been splashed around in here. There's certainly no shortage of it. Just finding that screw that had run away. Take the screws out of the retard gear train. Good set of fingerprints on the delay action or self timer. Those two trains I'll put aside, they can be soaking in some naphtha while I'm doing the rest of this job. I need to unhook this spring, and normally I put a screwdriver in here to hold that arm back so it doesn't pull across. Then I can pull on the spring and unhook it. If I don't put a screwdriver in there, almost inevitably the arm just tracks with the end of the spring and it's very hard to unhook it. And that was the pallet wheel. Remove this spring from the B lever. That spring also acts on the setting post here for the self timer flash sync speeds. Remove that spring. That's the front of the shutter stripped as far as it needs to come. At the back, 3 screws, and I'm pleased to see that all 3 are present and correct. Not uncommon for 1 or more of them to be missing. There's a flash connection there, and there's a little screw goes in there to clamp that flash connection together. So I'll just loosen that off. We can lift that off. What have we got here? Oh, this is just one of the shim washers from the back of the shutter. Now we're getting stripped down. Looking here at the diaphragm, the aperture diaphragm, it's very marked. So are the shutter blades, but the diaphragm blades in particular. I don't, as a rule, polish the diaphragm blades. Marks like that are largely cosmetic. They don't cause a problem by themselves. And although I would deal with cosmetic problems if it was going to be straightforward, typically with diaphragm blades it's not, because they have rivets on them that form the posts, they're pivots, and those are very greasy, and it's easy to catch a cleaning cloth or a cotton bud on those rivets, particularly if you're doing some more intensive action like polishing and damage something. Normally I limit myself to cleaning the blades with cotton buds and naphtha. Typically that's sufficient. Right, so we can split the case here. So here's our mechanism plate and shutter blades. Here's the shutter case with the aperture, the diaphragm, the aperture in place. This is all very oily in here. What the oil does is when it finds its way to the shutter blades, as it inevitably will do, it'll stick them together, particularly in cold weather. In hotter weather you might not notice the problem because the oil will be, this is all stuck together with oil. This is the diaphragm. In warmer weather you might not notice it because the oil will be less viscous. There's a flake of paint or something loose here. It's come from somewhere. Right, all of these components left to be cleaned, and I'll see what I can do with these diaphragm blades. It looks, I'm not sure what those dirty marks are. It's possible someone's had a go at flood cleaning the shutter. People will do things like that. Flood cleaning is a fairly useless way of dealing with shutters. These blades are quite stuck together with oil, as you can see. That pair came out together and don't want to part company. The mechanism plate is just dirty, and there's an excessive amount of lubricant here. You can see it there. That's graphite grease or something. That would have transferred through to the shutter blade at that point almost certainly. And there's a patch of oil visible here, and all of that's got to be gone. Alright, the cleaning begins. I'll start cleaning these components up. And I'm starting with the diaphragm blades. I'm interested to see how well they clean up, because they are certainly very marked. Yeah, those marks are pretty permanent. If these were diaphragm blades from a Retina Reflex type 025, they would need to snap down into the set position when the shutter cycled, and in that case I probably would do some more work on these blades and possibly polish some of those marks out of them, but because it's a rangefinder camera and that's not required, I won't. It's certainly a lot better than it was. You can pair it with one of the dirty blades. Yeah, it's cleaning up quite well. It's say 80% of the stuff is coming off there. It tells me that that's probably oil. It might be deposits of dirt that have come on there. If the shutter's been flood cleaned, some people flood clean shutters, take the whole shutter and immerse it in some solvent. It has a habit of moving contaminants from one spot to another. Of course, if you do that and you allow the solvents to evaporate, it'll just leave the contaminants behind as it evaporates, and that commonly happens. You end up with contaminants that began somewhere finding their way to somewhere you'd like them even less. Now that blade's more marked. It's not pleased with that. As long as the blades open and close smoothly with little resistance, this will be fine. On this camera, the aperture and shutter settings are linked together with a clip, and you can change the relative position of the two, but they remain linked together with a spring clip. if there's too much resistance on these blades because they're sticky, you may find that the resistance is sufficient to overcome the grab of the clip, and so the clip might jump and you end up with an exposure which was not what you were expecting. But as long as these move smoothly, there won't be a problem. They don't look bad enough to me to cause a problem once the soil contamination is off them. It's the oil that causes the grief. Polished thin metal surfaces can effectively be glued together by oils, or indeed by any other wet substance. Water would do it. It will stick them together. So this component is the moving ring that swings the blades inwards or outwards. It's got a very funny appearance to it. There's a whole series of small dots over the surface, little corrosion spots by the looks of them. It's very unusual. I'm not familiar with seeing that sort of pattern of corrosion. This face is fine. This is the face that goes towards the case. This is the face that goes towards the blades, and it's quite marked. Don't know what to make of that. And here's the retainer, and this is also the plate that the blades pivot in. And this face I'm cleaning at the moment is the face that goes towards the diaphragm blades. It's quite oily, as you could probably tell by the oily sheen that it had before I started cleaning it. But there's also spots of corrosion on here. And one big corroded fingerprint right over here, where somebody's grasped it between finger and thumb. And this side, this face faces the shutter blades. It's very oily. But there's no corrosion on here. So the corrosion is all limited to the diaphragm side, the aperture diaphragm side. Interesting. It may mean that somebody had stripped the shutter for service, but they hadn't stripped the diaphragm out, and they attempted to clean that in place. Perhaps they were using some solvent to do the cleaning. Perhaps there was some water content in the solvent. I'm thinking if they were using an alcohol. to do their cleaning. It may well have had a component of water in there, and that the alcohol's vaporised off and left the water in behind later to cause those corrosion problems. That's just idle speculation, of course. I don't know the history. I'm cleaning the case carefully now. The case is quite oily. A lot of the oil will have percolated through from the focus helical mechanism, and that would be promoted by the camera having been left in somewhere hot, like a car glove box or something like that. Yep. Well, that case is cleaned up quite well. That should be fine. There's the 3 screws that hold this together. I'll just give them a brief clean. They don't usually require anything unless the shutter's been very oily. And the diaphragm I can reassemble. Here's my jig for assembling things. Assembling diaphragms anyway. Let's move in a bit closer. That's the plate. Now that's got a little rivet on that plate. The rivet side should be up. Get these blades in position. It's easy getting the first couple of blades in because you can see where they're to be fitted. By the time you get here, you've got to pull the blades back to expose the hole for the pivot to go in. Fortunately for me, these shutters only have 5 diaphragm blades, and so they're comparatively simple. Now I just need to lift the early blades over the last blades without disturbing anything. Put the moving plate in place. Obviously its post goes upwards. I happen to know it goes here. It's seated in position, and then the case goes on, and that little post that was on that plate, visible there, goes into a hole in the case. So I can see where it's to be located. A wriggle. I think that's seated. Let's flip that over. Just having a quick nosy to see, make sure that the pivots haven't popped out of their respective sockets, and it all looks good. Let's get one screw down. Let's do that up quite lightly. Get its mates in place, same deal, just do it up very lightly. Be a bit cautious when you're tightening up screws on a plate like this, because if one of the blades is shifted and come out of position, you could damage it if you tighten up a screw and trap something. Let's see how we go. It's sticking. It tells me that one of those blades is out of position. Slacken those screws off slightly. Yeah, I just tapped that once or twice and that was enough to get the pin concerned to drop into the slot. Now I can tighten up the 3 screws. And I can check the action again. Yes, that's quite smooth. If it was rough, if it was stiff at this stage, knowing that I've already got all the blades cleaned and that they weren't going to get any better by further cleaning, you can put a little bit of graphite powder in here and work it in and then blow out all the excess afterwards, and that will make them run very smoothly indeed. But you have to be very careful to blow out all the graphite powder afterwards, otherwise it has a habit of escaping and settling on the inside surfaces of the lenses, and that would reduce image contrast if there's enough of it in there. It's very sparkly stuff. Just looking at the state of these blades, and I can sort of see the pattern of marks on them. I'm trying to figure out what that indicates, if anything. Nothing particularly to me. Yeah, there's certainly the sort of marks I associate with liquids. They're like almost like drying marks, you know, like coffee rings. Anyway, that's that part of the job done. That's the shutter case, the diaphragm mechanism. That's all good. And turn my attention to the shutter blades and the mechanism plate. We'll start with the shutter blades. If I can pick this one up. Here we go. Again, I'm interested to see how well these clean up, because often you can't tell initially whether they're going to be a problem or not, particularly if they've got a good coating of dirt on them. It's got exactly the same sort of staining on these blades that I was seeing on the diaphragm blades. It looks like yeah, I'm going to polish these blades with brass, so it's more important that the shutter blades are smooth, free from blemishes, because they have to slide over each other, and you need them to slide over each other promptly, not hesitate because the surfaces are rough, or run slowly because the surfaces are rough. Here, I would characterise the marks here that I'm seeing as corrosion. The pattern of it's a little bit odd, I suspect. I honestly can't tell. It's certainly the same sort of patterning that I'm seeing on the diaphragm blades. The diaphragm blades are less of a problem because we don't need them to move rapidly. If I was to have a guess, I'd say someone flood cleaned this shutter with isopropyl, and they may have used something else. If you use a very volatile substance, it doesn't need to contain water. Some substances are very volatile, you spray them with it. I'm thinking of the likes of brake cleaner or something like that. You could spray it with that, and what happens is that both the action of the spraying action of the stuff coming out of the can will chill down the object that you're washing off, so you're cooling it down with the stuff you're spraying on there because it's coming out extremely cold. And as the stuff evaporates, if it's a very volatile substance, it also robs heat out of the thing you're washing down, and you end up with a very cold, clean shutter. And if you're in a nice humid atmosphere, the first thing it does is that moisture settles out of the air, condenses onto the cold, clean metal. And it may be that this is what's happened in this case. None of the stuff I'm seeing here, none of this pattern would make sense from the point of view of a shutter that had evolved this problem naturally. This is something that's happened as a result of a service. I'm going to have to polish these blades with brasso.